The station, called Clarity of Purpose, hung in the black silence of space, like a metal tooth waiting to bite down on something soft. And today, that something had finally arrived. Commander Thesic stood at the observation window of the intake bay, with his clawed hands folded behind his back, watching the captured gunship being pulled into the docking cradle by tractor beams. And he allowed himself a thin smile, because this was what he lived for. This was the part of his work that made every cold cycle aboard this station worth enduring. He was Velshari, tall and scaled, with eyes like polished amber, and a jaw that could crack bone if he ever lowered himself to something so crude. But Thesic had never needed to use his teeth on a prisoner, because the Velshari Dominion did not break bodies. They broke minds. And Thesic was the finest mind-breaker the Dominion had ever produced. Behind him, the intake report flickered across his data screen, and he turned to read it one more time, even though he had already memorized every word. One prisoner, it said, recovered from a disabled Terran gunship drifting near the Aran corridor. Species classification, human. Rank, captain. Name, Eravos. Unit designation, 4th Drop Regiment, also known as the Gravediggers. Thesic had never seen a human before, and very few in the Dominion had, because this was a new species, barely a century into interstellar travel. And yet somehow they had pushed their way into contested space with the confidence of a species 10 times their age. And High Command wanted to know everything about them, their fleet positions, their weapons, their numbers, their weaknesses, and most importantly, whether they had any weaknesses at all. The Velshari method of extracting this information was elegant and proven, and it was called the Unraveling, a multi-phase interrogation protocol that used curated footage of extreme violence combined with environmental terror simulations. Sensory overload, to psychologically dismantle a prisoner before a single question was ever asked. And it had a perfect record across 42 species, spanning 300 star systems. Because every living creature in the galaxy feared something, and the Unraveling found that fear, and cracked it open like an egg. Thesic had personally overseen the breaking of Cathari warlords who had fought wars for centuries. He had shattered the minds of Rinith hive commanders whose neural networks spanned entire continents. He had reduced a Gorvathi battle priest to a weeping wreck in under 6 hours, and every single one of them had ended the same way, curled up on the floor of the interrogation chamber, begging to tell him whatever he wanted to know. He expected nothing different from this human. The docking clamps engaged with a deep metallic thud that Thesic felt in his chest, and he straightened his uniform and walked toward the intake corridor where 2 armed guards were, already waiting with restraint pulls. And when the airlock hissed open, he got his first look at Captain Era Voss of the Terran Expeditionary Corps. She was small. That was the first thing that struck him, and it struck him hard, because she was genuinely small, shorter than most Velshari juveniles, with a compact frame and close-cropped dark hair, and skin that was a warm brown color he had never seen on any species before. And she walked out of the airlock under her own power, even though her wrists were bound in magnetic cuffs, and she looked around the intake bay with the casual curiosity of someone arriving at a transit hub, rather than a prisoner being delivered to the most feared interrogation station in the quadrant. Thesic studied her face, and found no fear there, and no anger either, just a calm, steady expression that reminded him of still water. And her eyes moved across the room, taking in details the way a soldier would, noting exits and guard positions, and sight lines. And then those eyes landed on Thesic, and she looked at him the way someone might look at a menu they had seen before. She had scars, he noticed, a lot of them, thin white lines and rough patches that crossed her forearms and climbed up the side of her neck and disappeared under the collar of her gray uniform. And these were not decorative marks or ritual scarring like some species practiced. These were the marks of someone who had been hurt many times, and had healed, and had gone back to the place that hurt her. The guards locked the restraint poles to her cuffs and began to march her toward the interrogation wing. And Fesic fell into step beside her because he liked to walk with his prisoners, liked to let them feel the size of him, liked to watch the fear begin to build in their eyes as the corridor grew darker and the air grew colder, and the hum of the station took on that low, threatening frequency that the engineers had calibrated specifically to trigger panic responses in mammalian nervous systems. Erebos did not panic. She walked with an easy stride, almost relaxed, and at one point she glanced up at Fesic and said in perfectly translated common speech, "So is this the part where you ask me things, or the part where you try to scare me first?" Fesic did not answer, because he never spoke to prisoners before the unraveling began. That was protocol. But her words lodged in his mind like a splinter, because no prisoner had ever asked him that before. No prisoner had ever looked at the corridor leading to the interrogation chamber and framed it as something so ordinary, so predictable, so boring. They reached the chamber, and the guards locked her into the restraint chair, a massive seat designed for species twice her size, so she looked almost childlike sitting in it. And the technicians behind the observation glass began running their pre-session calibrations. And Fesic took his position at the control podium and looked down at her one final time before they began. She looked back at him, and there was something in her eyes that he could not identify. Something that was not fear, and not defiance, and not even courage exactly, but something quieter than all of those things. Something that sat beneath them, like bedrock beneath a mountain. He would learn later what that look was called. Humans called it experience. But right now, Commander Fesic did not know that. And so he pressed the activation key on the podium, and the lights in the chamber went dark, and the unraveling began. And he was confident, absolutely confident, that this small, scarred creature would break, like all the others before her. The first phase of the unraveling was called the cage, and it was designed to attack the most basic survival instincts that lived inside every creature with a brainstem. The walls of the interrogation chamber began to move inward with a low, grinding sound that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of whoever sat in the restraint chair. And the ceiling dropped lower, inch by inch, and the temperature plummeted so fast that frost began forming on the metal surfaces. And then, without warning, the cold reversed, and heat blasted from every vent, until the air shimmered, and the prisoners' skin would flush, and their breathing would quicken, and their heart rate would spike. Strobe lights fired in patterns specifically engineered to disrupt neural processing. Random bursts of white and red and a sickening yellow-green that triggered nausea in most carbon-based life forms. And sound came next. Not just loud, but wrong. Frequencies layered on top of each other, so they clashed, and scraped inside the skull, like two rocks grinding together. And beneath it all, a subsonic pulse that most species could not consciously hear, but that their bodies felt as a deep primal wrongness that screamed at them to run. The smell came last. Ozone and rot, and something chemical and sharp pumped through the vents, in concentrations calculated to overwhelm olfactory systems without causing permanent damage. Because the Velshari were precise in their cruelty, they did not want to destroy their prisoners. They wanted to unmake them just enough that the pieces could be reassembled into something cooperative. Behind the observation glass, Fesic watched the sensor feeds that monitored the human's vitals: heart rate, respiration, cortisol levels, neural activity, and he waited for the spike, the beautiful, terrifying spike that always came when a prisoner's mind finally understood that it was trapped and helpless, and that nobody was coming to save it. Her eyes. Her heart rate did not spike, it dipped, dropping from a resting 62 beats per minute down to 58, and her breathing slowed to a deep, steady rhythm, and her cortisol levels remained so flat that the technician monitoring them actually tapped the sensor twice, thinking it had malfunctioned. She fell asleep. She fell asleep in the restraint chair while the walls closed in and the temperature swung between freezing and burning, and the lights screamed and the sound tore at the air and the stench of death poured through the vents, and she slept the way a cat sleeps in a sunbeam, completely and without apology. Fesick stared at the sensor readout for a long time, and then he looked through the glass at the small human woman slumped comfortably in the oversized chair, with her chin on her chest and her scarred hands relaxed in their cuffs. And he felt something shift inside him, something he did not yet have a name for. 2. The walls stopped moving, and the temperature stabilized, and the lights went dark. And then every surface in the chamber became a screen, floor and ceiling and all four walls, and the footage began. This was the heart of the unraveling, the part that had broken every species the Velshari had ever captured, because the Dominion had spent centuries collecting the most horrific combat recordings from across the galaxy, and they had assembled them into a sequence that built like a symphony of violence, each clip worse than the last, each one chosen to target a different fear response. The fall of Cathari Prime played first, a city of 12 million burning from orbit, while its defenders ran through the streets, like insects fleeing a fire. And the audio was unfiltered, every scream preserved in perfect clarity. And then came the slaughter pits of Rin, where prisoners of war were processed by machines that did not care whether they were alive or dead when the processing began. And then the devouring of Station Omicron, where a Velshari biological weapon had been deployed, and the footage showed what happened to organic tissue when it encountered something designed to unmake it at the cellular level. Species that had survived centuries of warfare broke during the Cathari footage. Hardened soldiers who had killed with their own hands went catatonic during the Rin sequence. And nothing with a functioning nervous system had ever made it through the Omicron recording without psychological damage. Era opened one eye. She watched the screens for about 10 seconds, her single open eye moving from wall to ceiling with the lazy disinterest of someone flipping through channels on a screen and finding nothing worth watching. And then she yawned. It was not a small yawn, or a polite yawn, or a yawn she tried to hide behind her bound hands. It was a full, open-mouthed, shameless yawn that stretched her jaw wide and squeezed her eyes shut. The kind of yawn that came from deep in the chest and announced to the world that the yawner was deeply and profoundly bored. And then she spoke, and her voice was calm and clear, and carried through the chamber audio pickups and into the observation room, where Fesick and his entire technical team stood frozen. "Oh," she said, "that's from my first deployment." Nobody moved. Fesick felt the words hit him like a physical force, and he turned to the lead technician and said in a voice that was quieter than he intended, "Verify that." And the technician's clawed fingers scrambled across the console, pulling metadata from the footage stream and cross-referencing it against the human's captured service record. The results came back in under a minute, and the technician's scales went pale, which was something Fesick had never seen happen to a Velshari technician in all his years of service. One of the clips in the combat sequence was authentic Terran military footage recovered from a battlefield data recorder during the siege of Harkin's world, a human operation from 6 standard years ago. And according to the service record pulled from Captain Voss's uniform tags, she had been deployed to Harkin's world with the 4th Drop Regiment at the age of 22 standard human years. She had not recognized the footage because it was similar to something she had experienced. She had recognized the footage because it was literally a recording of something she had survived. Fesick looked through the glass at her again, and she had already closed her eyes and gone back to sleep. And around him, the footage continued to play its gallery of horrors across every surface in the chamber, and the sound of screaming filled the room. And for the first time in his career, Commander Fesick reached out and turned off the display. Not because it was affecting the prisoner, because it was starting to affect him. Silence of the observation room with his team, and he felt something cold settle into his chest, something that wrapped around his heart and squeezed. And he recognized it because he had spent his entire career putting this exact feeling into other beings. It was fear. And the worst part, the part that would keep him awake through the rest of that long, dark cycle, was that the thing he was afraid of was currently asleep in a chair designed for creatures 3 times her size, and she was dreaming peacefully while the most sophisticated psychological weapon in the galaxy played around her like a lullaby she had heard too many times to care about anymore. Thesic did not sleep that night, and when the next cycle began, he entered the interrogation chamber determined to take control of the situation, because he was Commander Thesic. He had broken 42 species, and he was not going to be undone by a creature the size of a Velshari child who apparently treated psychological warfare as a sleeping aid. He sat across from Era Voss in a chair that had been brought in specifically so he could sit at her level, because standing over her had not worked, and his training told him to try a different posture. And he placed his data tablet on the table between them, and he asked his first direct question. "Tell me about your fleet positions in the Oran corridor." Era looked at him the way she might look at someone who had asked her a very boring question at a very long dinner, and she tilted her head slightly and said, "No." Thesic had expected this, because prisoners always refused at first. The unraveling, it was supposed to soften them, so that when the direct questions came, they were already broken enough to answer. But the unraveling had not worked on this one, so he pressed forward with the standard secondary approach, which was to present the consequences of non-cooperation in vivid and specific terms. He told her about the extended isolation protocols, the sensory deprivation tanks, the neural disruptors that could make every nerve in her body feel like it was on fire without leaving a single mark. And he described each one in careful detail, watching her face for the micro-expressions that would tell him which threat was landing. Era listened politely, and when he finished, she said, "That all sounds pretty bad." And then she leaned forward in her chair and said, "Do you want to hear about Harkin's world instead?" Thesic was thrown off balance, because this was not how prisoners behaved. Prisoners either resisted in silence, or they broke and began talking. They did not make counter-offers, like they were negotiating a trade agreement. But something in his instinct told him to let her talk, because sometimes prisoners revealed things they did not intend to reveal. So he leaned back and gestured with one clawed hand for her to continue. And Era Voss began to tell him a story. She told him about the siege of Harkin's world, a colony planet on the edge of Terran space that had come under attack by a species she did not name, but simply called the enemy. And she told him that when her unit received the deployment orders, the siege had already been going for 3 weeks, and the colony's defenders were nearly gone, and everyone in the briefing room knew this was not a mission they were expected to win. They were being sent to buy time, she said. Nothing more. Hold the line long enough for the civilian transports to finish evacuating 60,000 people, and then get out if they could. And everyone in the 4th Drop Regiment understood what "if they could" really meant. She told him about the drop itself, how the transport shook so hard during atmospheric entry that the soldier next to her bit through his own lip and bled all over his combat vest, and how when the doors opened and they hit the ground running, the air tasted like metal and smoke and something sweet that she later learned was the chemical residue of the weapons being used on the colony's infrastructure. She told him about her squad leader, a man named Sergeant Cade Morrow, who was 2 meters tall and had hands like shovels, and who laughed at everything, including things that were not remotely funny. And how on the 3rd day of the siege, when the defensive line collapsed at the eastern corridor, Morrow had held a reinforced doorway with nothing but his body and his rifle, while 43 children from the colony school ran through the gap behind him. She described how Morrow had braced himself against the doorframe and fired until his rifle overheated, and then fired some more and took hits to his shoulder and his leg and his side and did not move, not 1 step, not 1 centimeter, until every child was through. And how when the last one passed him, he looked back and grinned through the blood on his face, and said, "See, that's what I'm talking about," before the medic dragged him to cover. Thesic listened and said nothing. Era told him about the 9 days that followed, 9 days without resupply, 9 days of shrinking perimeters and dwindling ammunition, and sleep measured in minutes rather than hours. And she told him about carrying a wounded soldier named Private Osei across 4 kilometers of open ground, while enemy fire kicked up dirt around her feet. And Osei kept apologizing for being heavy, and she kept telling him to shut up and stay awake. She told him that Osei died 30 meters from the extraction point, that she felt him go still on her back, and knew it the way you know when a fire goes out, just a sudden absence of warmth, and she carried him the last 30 meters anyway, because you do not leave people behind, even when they are beyond saving, because that is not the point. The point is that they are yours, and you carry them. She told all of this without tears, and without her voice breaking, and without any of the emotional displays Thesic had catalogued across dozens of species when they recounted traumatic events. She told it the way someone might describe a long, difficult day at work, with clarity and acceptance and a complete absence of self-pity. When she finished, Thesic was quiet for a while, and then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment she started talking. "How do your people endure this?" Era looked at him with an expression he could not read, something between amusement and genuine puzzlement, and she said endure it, as if the word itself confused her. "We volunteer for it." Did not believe her. He could not believe her, because the concept was so alien to everything he understood about warfare and survival and the behavior of intelligent beings, that it simply did not fit inside his mind. So he pulled up his data tablet and ran a query through the intelligence database on Terran military recruitment practices. The results came back clean and verified from multiple independent sources. The Terran Expeditionary Corps was an all-volunteer force. No conscription, no genetic modification, no chemical conditioning, no neural programming, no coercion of any kind. Every single human who put on the uniform and dropped into combat had chosen to do so freely, and many of them had fought through selection processes so demanding that more candidates washed out than made it through. Thesic read the data 3 times because he kept thinking he had misunderstood something, and each time the data said the same thing. These humans were not forced to fight. They were not bred to fight. They were not modified or drugged or programmed to fight. They simply chose to walk into the worst places the galaxy had to offer, and they did it knowing full well what waited for them there, because many of them had already been there before, and had come back voluntarily for more. The Velshari Dominion had built its empire on breaking the minds of species that were forced into conflict, conscripts and drafted soldiers, and creatures fighting because their governments, or their biology, or their social structures gave them no other option. And the unraveling worked on them because somewhere deep inside every one of them was a voice that said, "I did not choose this." And that voice was the crack that the Velshari drove their wedge into. There was no crack in Ira Voss. There was no hidden voice saying she did not choose this, because she had chosen it, fully and freely, and with complete knowledge of what it would cost her. That cost, and carried it, and come back for more. And the scars on her arms were not evidence of victimhood, they were receipts. Thesic ended the session early, and went back to his quarters, and pulled up everything the Dominion's intelligence network had on the species called humanity. And there was not much, because they were new to the galactic stage, and the Velshari had not considered them a priority until very recently. Was the same look he had seen on the faces of every prisoner he had ever broken. It was the look of someone who was beginning to understand that they were not in control. Thesic brought in Dr. Viss on the 3rd day because he needed someone to tell him he was wrong. Someone with credentials and authority to look at the data and the prisoner and explained to him that there was a weakness he had simply missed. A crack in the human's armor that a trained eye could find and a skilled hand could pry open. Dr. Viss was the most respected xenopsychologist in the Velshari Dominion, a small, sharp-eyed female with silver scales and a reputation for reading minds the way other people read text. And she had profiled hundreds of species and had never encountered one she could not map and categorize and ultimately predict. She arrived at the station with a single case of equipment and a quiet confidence that Thesic found deeply reassuring, and he briefed her on everything that had happened: the Unraveling's failure, the combat footage, the Yawned, the stories about Harkin's world, the volunteer revelation, all of it. Expression, and then asked to observe the prisoner. They put Viss behind the two-way glass with a full suite of cognitive and emotional analysis equipment, and Thesic watched her watch Era Voss for 6 straight hours. And during those 6 hours, Era did very little. She sat in her holding cell and stretched, and did exercises on the floor, and hummed a tune that the translation software could not identify. And at one point, she braided a small piece of thread she had pulled from her uniform sleeve into a complicated knot pattern, and then undid it, and started over. Viss ran her analyses in silence, tracking micro-expressions and neural patterns through the scanner array, and cross-referencing them against her database of species-specific psychological profiles. And when she was finished, she sat back from her equipment and was quiet for a long time before she turned to Thesic. Her report was not what he wanted to hear. "She shows no signs of psychopathy," Viss said. "Sociopathy, no emotional suppression, no dissociative disorders, no trauma-induced numbing. None of the psychological damage markers I would expect from a being that has experienced the level of violence indicated in her service record." Thesic asked what that meant, and Viss told him it meant that Era Voss was by every metric available to Velshari science psychologically healthy, not just functional, but genuinely well-adjusted, warm, empathetic, possessed of a sharp humor and a stable sense of identity, the kind of mind that in any species would be considered a model of mental resilience. "She is not broken," Viss said, and there was something in her voice that Thesic had never heard before, something that sounded almost like admiration. "She is not numb. She has not walled off her emotions or disconnected from her experiences. She has simply integrated trauma into a functional framework. She has looked at the worst things the galaxy can produce, and she has processed them and filed them away and continued living. And she does this not because she cannot feel pain, but because she has decided that pain is not a reason to stop." Viss paused, and then added the word that would keep Thesic awake for many more nights. "Humans call it resilience." She closed her analysis files and looked directly at Thesic and said, "The unraveling will not work on this species, Commander. And I say that not as a suggestion, but as a professional assessment. You cannot frighten a people who have already frightened themselves and walk through the other side. Their entire psychological architecture is built around the assumption that terrible things will happen and that they will survive them. And you cannot use fear as a weapon against someone whose relationship with fear is older and deeper and more intimate than anything you can manufacture in a chamber." Thesic dismissed her and sat alone in the observation room and tried to think of another approach and could not find one. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the station, and it was happening quietly in the corridors and the guard rotations and the mess hall conversations where crew members talked during their breaks. Era Voss was making friends. The guards assigned to her holding cell reported that she was cooperative and polite, and that she asked them questions about their lives and their families, and remembered their answers. And one guard, whose name was Torvak, had mentioned during a routine check that he was having difficulty with a strategic board game his clutchmates had sent him, and Era had offered to teach him a human card game instead. And she had fashioned cards from torn strips of ration packaging and taught Torvak a game called poker, using meal tokens as stakes. Within 2 days, Torvok was bringing other guards to learn during shift changes, and Era was winning consistently, but letting them win often enough to keep them interested. And she learned all their names, and asked Torvok about his clutchmates, and asked another guard named Syl about the plants she was growing in her quarters, and asked a third named Drek why he seemed sad. And Drek had told her about his broodmate's illness, before he even realized he was confiding in a prisoner. Thesic found out about all of this through the security monitoring system, and when he reviewed the footage, he saw something that chilled him more than anything that had happened in the interrogation chamber. His crew was not guarding Ira Voss. They were gathering around her. She had become the center of a small social gravity on his station, and she had done it without manipulation or deception or any of the psychological techniques that Thesic would have recognized and countered. She had done it simply by being kind and interested and genuinely caring about the beings around her. And the Velshari crew, who spent their lives in a rigid military hierarchy, built on dominance and fear, responded to her warmth the way cold-blooded creatures respond to sunlight. They could not help themselves. Thesic realized with a horror that sat like ice in his stomach that the prisoner was not being broken by the station. The station was being broken by the prisoner. He ordered Era transferred immediately to a maximum security holding cell in the restricted section of the station, away from general crew, and the transfer was carried out, but the damage was already done, because the crew whispered to each other in the corridors and in the mess hall and during shift changes, and the whisper was always the same question, asked in different ways. What kind of species yawns at the unraveling? What kind of creature sleeps through the worst we can do? What kind of being walks into our darkest room and makes friends with the guards? Thesic could feel the fear spreading through his station like a temperature change. The sharp, acute fear that the unraveling was designed to produce, but something slower and deeper. The dawning realization that perhaps the Velshari were not the most psychologically formidable species in the galaxy. That perhaps somewhere out there in the dark, between the stars, there was a species that had mastered fear so completely that it could not be used against them. And then the long-range sensor station pinged. Thesic was in his command center when the alert came through, and he pulled up the display and saw 3 signatures emerging from subspace at the edge of the system. 3 Terran warships running in a tight formation with their weapons powered and their shields up. And they were not trying to hide, and they were not running, and they were not requesting communication through diplomatic channels. They were broadcasting on every frequency, military and civilian and emergency, and even the old navigation bands that nobody used anymore. Broadcasting a single repeated message in clear, unencrypted common speech. We are here for our captain. You can return her, or we can come get her. You have 1 cycle. Thesic read the message 3 times, and then looked at the sensor data showing the size of the approaching ships, and they were small, smaller than his station's escort frigates. And for a brief moment he felt a flash of the old confidence, because 3 small ships against a fully armed station and its garrison was not a serious threat by any military calculation. But then he remembered the yawn, and he remembered what Era Voss had said about volunteers, and the confidence died in his chest like a flame that had run out of air. The station went to battle alert, and the corridors filled with the sound of running feet and shouted orders, and the deep hum of weapon systems powering up from standby. And Thesic stood in the command center, watching the 3 Terran ships on the sensor display, and counting down the time he had left to make a decision. He contacted Dominion High Command on the priority channel and requested immediate reinforcements, and the response came back within minutes. The nearest Velshari fleet was 2 full cycles away and could not reach the system before the human deadline expired, and High Command's orders were to use his own judgment and defend the station's assets, which in cold military language meant the prisoner. Thesic had 1,000 crew members aboard the Clarity of Purpose. Combat-trained Velshari soldiers, supported by automated defense systems, and shielded corridors, and blast doors designed to withstand boarding actions. And by every tactical calculation he had ever been taught, 1,000 defenders against 3 small ships should not have been a question worth asking. But Thesic had spent the last 3 days learning things about humans that no tactical calculation could account for. He pulled up every intelligence report the Dominion had on Terran naval engagements, and found almost nothing, because humanity was new, and the Velshari had not yet fought them directly. But the scattered reports that did exist came from other species who had, and those reports were written in language that Thesic had never seen in military documents before. Language that sounded less like tactical analysis, and more like warnings scratched on the walls of a cave by someone who had barely survived what they were describing. One report from a Cathari border skirmish described a single Terran frigate engaging 3 Cathari warships and refusing to disengage even after taking critical damage. And the Cathari commander had written that the human ship fought as though destruction was not a consequence it was willing to acknowledge, and that even after its main weapons were disabled, it had accelerated directly into the lead Cathari vessel and detonated its reactor core at point-blank range. Another report described a Terran ground force of 40 soldiers holding a mining outpost against 200 Gorvathi raiders for 11 days without reinforcement. And when the relief force finally arrived, they found 31 surviving humans still fighting from behind barricades they had built from the bodies of fallen Gorvathi. Thesic closed the files and stood in the silence of the command center, and felt the weight of his 1,000 crew members pressing down on him like gravity. And then he did something he had never done in his entire career. He went to see the prisoner. Era Voss was sitting on the floor of her maximum security cell, doing something with the knotted thread she had made from her uniform sleeve. She looked up when Thesic entered, and her expression was the same calm, steady thing it had been since the moment she arrived, as if nothing that had happened on this station had touched her in any meaningful way. Thesic did not sit. He stood and looked down at her, and asked his question, not as an interrogator this time, but as a soldier talking to another soldier. "What will happen if I do not release you?" Era set down her thread and looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes that might have been sympathy. Not pity, but genuine sympathy, the kind that comes from someone who understands what you are going through, because they have been through something like it themselves. "Commander," she said, "those 3 ships out there, that's a retrieval team. 3 ships, probably 60 Marines. You have what, 1,000 crew on this station?" Thesic nodded, and he felt a brief warmth in his chest, because the numbers were on his side. Something he understood. Era shook her head slowly, not with arrogance, but with the patient certainty of someone explaining something obvious to someone who had not yet learned it. "You don't have enough people." Thesic opened his mouth to argue, but she held up one scarred hand and continued. "The 4th Drop Regiment has a saying, Commander. Nobody gets left behind, not while one of us is still breathing. And those 60 Marines out there, they know I'm on this station, and they volunteered for this mission. Every one of them. They walked into the briefing room and heard the plan, and they raised their hands and said yes, knowing that they might die, knowing that some of them probably will die, and they are at peace with that." She stood up slowly, and she was so much smaller than him that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. But somehow the size difference no longer seemed to matter. "They will breach this station," she said, "and they will move through your corridors, and they will not stop. They will not retreat. They will not negotiate once that timer runs out, and they will keep coming until they find me, or until every last one of them is dead. And if every last one of them does die, then the 4th Drop Regiment will send more. And if the regiment runs out of people, then the Terran Expeditionary Corps will send more. And this will not end, Commander. This will not ever end, because that is who we are." Thesic felt the cold in his chest again, that same fear he had first felt when she yawned at the combat footage, but now it was deeper and wider, and he understood it better. "Your whole strategy is built on fear," Era said, and her voice was not angry or gloating or triumphant. It was just honest, the way a doctor is honest when they tell you something you need to hear. "That's your problem. You looked out into the galaxy and you saw species you could terrorize into submission. And it worked. It worked for centuries. Right up until you met the species that was already afraid." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something deep and personal, that Fesick recognized as the face of someone speaking from a place they did not visit often. "We are afraid all the time, Commander. We are afraid of dying, and afraid of pain, and afraid of losing the people we love. And every human who has ever walked into combat has felt that fear like a fire in their chest. But we decided a long time ago that there is something we are more afraid of than any of that. We are afraid of failing each other, of leaving someone behind, of being the one who did not go back. And that fear, our fear, is bigger than any fear you could ever put in a room and point at us." She looked at him, and her eyes were clear and warm and completely without malice. "So you can keep me here and your station will burn, or you can let me go and learn the lesson, and the lesson is this: do not pick a fight with a species that is more afraid of disappointing each other than they are of dying." Fesick stood very still for a long time, long enough that the guard outside the cell shifted nervously. And then he turned and walked back to the command center, and gave the order to prepare a shuttle. They unshackled Era Voss and escorted her through the corridors of the Clarity of Purpose toward the shuttle bay. And she walked without hurry and without fear, just as she had walked in 3 days ago. And the crew members who lined the route watched her pass in silence. And Fesick could see in their faces that they would remember this small, scarred human woman for the rest of their lives. As she passed through the main corridor, she stopped next to a guard station, where a familiar Velshari stood at attention, trying very hard to maintain his professional composure. And Era looked up at Torvak and patted him on the arm with her scarred hand, and said, "You owe me a rematch." Jaw tightened, and his scales flushed, and he nodded once and said nothing, because he could not trust his voice. Era boarded the shuttle, and the bay doors opened, and the small craft slipped out into the dark, and crossed the distance between the station and the waiting Terran ships. And Fesick watched it on the sensor display until the shuttle docked with the lead vessel, and the docking clamps sealed. The 3 Terran warships held position for exactly 10 seconds after receiving their captain. 10 seconds during which every weapon system on every ship remained locked and ready. 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. And then, without a single word or a single shot fired, they turned in perfect formation and accelerated to the jump point and vanished into subspace. The sensor display went blank. The command center was silent. Dr. Viss stood beside Fesick, and she had been there for some time, though he had not noticed her arrive. And after a while, she asked him what he would report to High Command. Fesick watched the empty space where the Terran ships had been, and he thought about Era Voss sitting in the restraint chair with the galaxy's most terrifying footage playing on every wall around her. And he thought about the yawn, that shameless, devastating yawn that had cracked something open inside him that 3 days later had still not closed. "I will recommend that we do not engage the humans again," he said. Viss tilted her head, and her silver scales caught the light of the command displays. "Why?" Fesick turned away from the sensor screen and looked at her, and his face carried the expression of someone who had learned something that had cost him more than he could yet calculate. "Because we break minds for a living," he said, and they looked at everything we had and yawned. He paused, and then added in a voice so quiet that only Viss could hear it, "And then they taught my guards how to play." He walked out of the command center, and the door closed behind him, and the Clarity of Purpose continued its slow orbit in the silent dark. And somewhere far away, across the vast black distance between stars, Captain Erebos of the 4th Drop Regiment sat in the mess hall of a Terran warship and dealt a hand of poker to 3 grinning Marines who were very glad to see her. And she smiled, because she was home, and because nobody had been left behind.